Part 2 talks about body cavities and abdominal regions. The way that I set up these slides is so that you can study from them. So I'm not necessarily going to write all over these. I'm just going to point out a few of the cavities and allow you guys to kind of follow along with where these cavities are located. For all these cavities, it's important to know their name, their location, and what major organs you'd find inside of the cavities. So we'll start with letter A here. So A is the cranial cavity. So if you would want to study from these, you could potentially print this out, and then you could cut out just the pictures and kind of leave the terms off to the side, and then you could quiz yourself by trying to figure out what cavity is which. So cranial cavity contains the brain. Next cavity I'm going to talk about is right down the side here. It's H. It's the spinal cavity. And the spinal cavity contains the spinal cord. So those are considered the dorsal cavities. Now the ventral cavities include the thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic, but there's some different divisions within those. So I is referring to the thoracic. And the thoracic cavity is actually this entire chest cavity here. You can see that within the thoracic cavity, we have several sub-cavities. So the thoracic cavity, we have the right pleural cavity. So right, I'll abbreviate RT, pleural. And that contains the right lung. Then we have the left pleural cavity. And that contains the left lung. Now, why am I mixing up these left and right terms? I know when you look at the screen, you're looking at this and you're saying, well, that's on the left side of the body. In anatomy and physiology, we always refer to the side of the body from the patient's perspective. So if we look at this person's right side is this, and that's what I called the right pleural cavity. So whenever you're referring to a body part, you always want to take the perspective of the patient and refer to their left and right, not how you are looking at the body. So this is the right side of the body, and this over here is the left side of the body. So this is the right pleural cavity, which will contain the right lung. This is the left pleural cavity, which will contain the left lung. Then we have this pericardial cavity. The pericardial cavity contains the heart. Now again, if you break down this, we have peri, which means to surround, cardio, which is talking about the heart. So pericardial means it literally surrounds the heart. Then we have the mediastinum. Mediastinum contains some major blood vessels that come out of the heart, as well as the thymus and so forth. So that's its own kind of subcategory here. Now if we look on the side view, F right here is called the abdominal cavity, and G down here is called the pelvic cavity. But we can refer to both of these in all one term known as the abdominal pelvic cavity. And then break it down further, F would be the abdominal cavity, and G would be the pelvic cavity. We know the difference between the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity because it's divided by this huge muscle that goes across the body right here, known as the diaphragm. So that diaphragm completely seals off the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. There's just one tiny opening for the esophagus to squeeze through, and we'll learn about the esophageal hiatus later on in the semester. But other than that, it's completely sealed off. There's no way anything from the abdominal cavity could get up in the thoracic cavity and vice versa, because this diaphragm completely seals off the two cavities. The way that we tell the difference between the abdominal and pelvic cavity, it's really just the pelvic cavity is inside of the pelvis. But there's no set boundary that keeps it in here. Otherwise, there'd be no way for a baby to grow up into the abdomen of a woman. So the abdominal pelvic cavity is really kind of one big cavity, but we can divide it saying that the pelvic cavity is within the pelvis, but as soon as anything comes up out of the pelvis, then it's considered the abdominal cavity. So on this previous slide here, it says body cavities and linings. Every one of these cavities has a lining. There's a lining around the cavity itself, and then there's a lining around the actual organ. And that's where parietal versus visceral come into play. Parietal surrounds the cavity wall. Visceral surrounds the actual organ. So visceral is on the surface of the organ. If we look at the pericardial cavity, we have this membrane on the surface of the cavity wall. That is known as the parietal pericardium. So that's just a membrane that surrounds the cavity wall. Then this inner membrane, that's actually the surface of the heart, is known as the visceral pericardium. In between these two layers is fluid. It's pericardial fluid. And that fluid helps prevent friction as this organ is moving inside of the pericardial cavity. So we have a membrane that protects the cavity wall, we have a membrane that protects the organ outsides, and then we have fluid in between the two membranes to prevent friction. And this happens around all of the organs in the body. So we have the parietal pleura, which surrounds the pleural cavity. We have the visceral pleura, which surrounds the actual outside surface of the lung. Then we have the parietal peritoneum, and that's the outer or the lining of the cavity of the abdomen. And then we have the visceral peritoneum, which actually touches the surface of every abdominal organ. So within each cavity, we have these layers of tissue and then this fluid inside that prevents friction. The abdomen can be broken down into quadrants. Now, if you look inside here, you can see the lungs. Here's the heart, here's the other lung, and then here's that diaphragm muscle that I talked about. Anything above the diaphragm does not count as part of the abdominal quadrants. So if you're asked an exam or a quiz question that talks about, is the left lung in the right upper quadrant or in the left upper quadrant or so forth, you can't talk about the heart and lungs in any of the quadrants. So focusing on the quadrants, you need to be able to name them and list some major organs that would be found inside of them. So this, if you remember, is the right side of the body. So this is the upper part of the abdomen. Thus, we would call this one right here the right upper quadrant, abbreviated RUQ. Over here, we have the left upper quadrant, LUQ. Down here, you guessed it, we have the left or right lower quadrant. And over here, we have the left lower quadrant. Now, when we list some of the organs that you'd find inside of each of these, for the right upper quadrant, we have the liver, gallbladder, part of the stomach, and intestines. Left upper quadrant, we have part of the liver, the stomach, pancreas, the spleen is actually hidden over here, and then some intestines. For the right lower quadrant, we have large intestine, cecum, small intestine, and then this little worm-like structure is the appendix. And we'll learn more about the appendix once we get to the digestive system and the lymphatic system. But the right lower quadrant, if a patient comes into the hospital complaining of severe right lower quadrant pain, usually they suspect something wrong with the appendix. If the patient comes in with severe right upper quadrant pain, they can suspect something wrong with the gallbladder. If a patient comes in with severe left upper quadrant pain, they may suspect something going on with the stomach, maybe an ulcer or something like that, or potentially something wrong with the spleen, or pancreatitis. Pancreas is right underneath the stomach, so that could be another cause of left upper quadrant pain. And then the left lower quadrant really just contains some intestines, and then of course you got the kidneys in here, but since they stretch out multiple quadrants, I'm not really going to go into that. And then the reproductive organs are kind of down here in the pelvis. So here you have the names, and I listed some of the major organs. The abdomen can also be divided into regions. So there's 4 quadrants, but there's 9 anatomical or abdominal regions of the abdomen. So you look at the abdominal regions. This again is the right side of the body. This is the left. This is the right hypochondriac. Right hypochondriac. Right hypochondriac contains the liver and gallbladder. Then we have the next one, the epigastric region. So epi means on top of or on the surface of. Gastric is talking about the stomach. So epigastric, this is on the surface or on top of the stomach. If a patient comes in with severe epigastric pain, that could be some type of stomach ulcer. The lumbar, continuing on with this one, the left hypochondriac. So we have right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, and then in the middle, the epigastric. In this left hypochondriac, you can see part of the stomach and then the spleen. Down here we have the right lumbar, left lumbar, and umbilical. In the lumbar regions, we have the kidneys, left and right kidneys, and then we have intestines in the umbilical region. Over here, we have the right iliac, we have the left iliac, and in the middle, we have the hypogastric. Hypo usually refers to less than or potentially lower than. So lower than the stomach, this is the hypogastric region. In the iliac regions, sometimes you'll hear them called the inguinal regions. Your textbook, I believe, uses the term iliac, so we'll kind of go with iliac for this class. Iliac region, here you can see this right iliac contains the appendix. So again, patient comes in with right iliac pain, it could be attributed to the appendix.